I'm thrift shopping, I come across this, and I didn't even notice it at first, but then I see your name on that byline on the front page of one of the most infamous, we'll say, covers of the Commercial Appeal ever.
Oh, it is.
I mean, first of all, just tell me how that came about. How did we get to that point? How did you get to Commercial Appeal first?
Oh, well, how I got to Commercial Appeal was when I was in college. I just walked in off the streets one day in the summertime looking for a summer job. And instead of going to warehouses and places like that to try to get a job, I was in journalism, so I went to the Commercial Appeal. And lo and behold, they eventually hired me as this sort of errand boy back then. And so I worked there in the summer of '73. I think I made a good enough impression with working hard. And after I graduated from Ole Miss, they wouldn't hire me right out of college, so I went to Jackson, Mississippi. But 2 years later, they hired me as a reporter, and it was in January of 1977.
Okay, so you know what's funny is that they would never hire me here either, and then finally, eventually, I was told no 3 times, and then they finally took me in to be their errand girl.
There you go.
All right, so now we're in Memphis. 77. I can't remember the year, which year he died. It was.
Yeah, it was 77.
Okay, I was going to say I thought it was a very
yeah.
important year. Okay, so that's January. Well, we've got a lot of things going on, but obviously August comes around.
Right.
How did we end up on the front page of that newspaper cover?
Well, I just happened to be working that day. I was supposed to, as a young reporter, I'd only been there, 8 months at that time, I was supposed to write the regular obituaries. They get the youngest reporter to write all of those obituaries that's in the newspaper every day. And so that was my assignment that day. And I had already sat down to start writing, calling the funeral homes and stuff. That's what reporters do. But then the editor, city editor, Angus McCarran, came out of his office and he had this wild look on his face. And he looked around for any reporter he could find. I just happened to be sitting there. And he looked at me and said, "You need to get to the hospital right now. Elvis is there, and they think he's dead." And I said, "What?" I didn't ask any more questions. I grabbed my pen and paper, and I didn't even drive to the hospital. It was only about 3 or 4 blocks up the street. I ran to the hospital, Baptist Hospital, right there on Union Avenue. When I got there, there was just all kind of activity going on. A lot of people. By that time, the television stations had shown up, and they were about to do some live stand-ups, and I just started asking people what was going on. And then by that time, a senior reporter showed up, Terry Keeter, and we just decided, let's just start interviewing people and see what we can get. And that's what I did. And when we finally got all of that done, got back to the newsroom, they said, "We want you two to write a combined story getting reaction from the hospital about Elvis dying." And that's what we did. They liked it well enough to put it on the front page, and the rest is history, because that is, I believe, the largest selling newspaper in the Commercial Appeal history.
I would imagine so. I mean, I found it, and you got so lucky. It's right on the curb.
Right on the
right
curb.
When it
My
bends,
name
your
is
name
right
is
there.
right there.
That's right.
So what is on your mind? I mean, you're running. I know it's only a few blocks, but like, what's going through your mind? Obviously, Elvis, I mean, hearing Elvis is possibly dead.
Yeah, possibly dead. I didn't know he was dead at that time.
Right. What's going through your mind?
Well, I mean, one thing was that, there had been reports that Elvis went to the hospital more than a few times. So it could have been, just he was there, he was being treated, and he probably was going to be released, so I thought about that. But then the frantic look on my editor's face told me that this was much more serious. I think he knew more than even what he told me, because he didn't have time to tell me. He wanted me to get out of the newsroom. And so all of that was running through my mind, but just the idea, I thought for a brief second, if Elvis is dead, this is the biggest story of my whole career right here. And I'm, 24 years old at that time. And so I'm thinking about all of that. And then when I get there, it is confirmed that Elvis is dead. I had one advantage in that a high school classmate of mine was working in the emergency room as, I guess, he wasn't an orderly, but he was just doing some work there, sort of a technician or something. And he told me a few things about what happened when they wheeled Elvis in. And
Can you tell us those things?
Well, I mean, just the excitement of it,
right.
and my friend told me that Elvis was not breathing when he was wheeled in the door, and most people knew it, but they didn't want to say anything. And so he saw Elvis coming in, and that was pretty much it. Just the atmosphere and the frantic nature of what was going on in the emergency room when they were wheeling him in earlier that day.
Yeah, I mean, in general rule, they have to take someone to the hospital to pronounce them anyway.
Right. They have to do that, and I think that's what they did here. I believe Elvis was dead at home. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, I agree on that.
Yeah.
Okay, so you get there and you find out. You just told me that at 24 you're thinking this is the biggest story of your career.
Oh yeah.
Almost, it's not 50, but close to 50 years later.
Yeah.
Where does it rank?
Oh, it's still the biggest story of my career. Oh, and no doubt about it. And in terms of the worldwide impact, oh, absolutely. Because when we got back to the newsroom that night, this was August 16th of 1977, we were getting phone calls from around the world. I mean, we could barely get our job. We were trying to get a story for the first edition. Back then, we had like 5 editions of the newspaper every day. And we could hardly get our work done with people calling. I had calls from Paris, I had calls from Australia, I had a call from England, London. Just people were calling trying to get information about this. So I knew it was the biggest story I've ever been involved in. Probably the only thing that comes even close was the inauguration of Barack Obama. I covered that and wrote a column about it, but even that does not rise to the level of the international impact that Elvis Presley's sudden death had, certainly on the newspaper and certainly on my involvement with the newspaper. It's the biggest story I've ever been involved in.
And why do you think that is?
Well, just because of the nature of Elvis. Elvis he may have been taken for granted at that time. People were sort of, oh, that's Elvis, he's around town. People didn't understand just what a global impact he had until he died. Because the very next day, and I lived at that time in an apartment not far from Graceland in Whitehaven. I happened to be off the next day, but I went to get some work on my car right there on Elvis Presley Boulevard down the street from Graceland. I couldn't get there because there were so many people. They flooded into town. People came from everywhere. And it was just a madhouse scene all along Elvis Presley Boulevard in front of Graceland. There's been nothing like it in Memphis before or since.
I want to talk about that, but first I want to just jump back a little bit to the day before when you were getting reaction. What was some of the reaction? Were people, did they already know, or when they
didn't know. Some of them didn't know.
So tell me kind of what, when they were speculating, and then once it was announced, how the scene just changed.
Well, in a lot of cases, the people I went to waiting rooms because I could get there, and so I spent a lot of time in the hospital's waiting rooms, and I was telling people that didn't know. They knew all the commotion that was going on. They could look out the window and see just a whole lot of people, and even news people. And so I told a lot of people that, yeah, Elvis is dead, to get their reaction, and they were just stunned, some of them. I remember one lady, I think she was from Arkansas, and she says, "Are you sure?" And she kept asking me, "Are you sure? This can't be true. Are you sure? Please tell me it's not true." And I had to say, "Yeah, it's true." And then she says, "I don't know what to say." And then another lady says, "Well, I'm just so depressed right now. It's hard to talk." I mean, that's the kind of reaction I was getting. People were just stunned about it. Again, they may have taken Elvis for granted during that period of time, but once they learned that he was dead, it was just an outpouring of grief and disbelief to a great extent. Yeah.
Well, denial is the first stage of grief, so that makes sense for people to not to be in shock. And honestly, what do you say? But like you said, that was a time period in his career where he was struggling with things, and people, he already made his Aloha comeback, and but we were falling into the 70s pretty heavily.
Well, we really were. We were getting into disco then.
Yeah. Which, what a world it would have been if we would have seen what disco Elvis would have been like.
Oh, I know, because he already had the suit.
He started it. He started the whole trend.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so now we're back on the day after. So I have to imagine this, probably reminiscent to what we see every year with the candlelight vigil where they shut down the street. So did you, and you stopped, you said you couldn't go through, did you, as a journalist, naturally just did you feel like you had to talk to people, or did you just kind of
Well, I talked to a few people, and I think I even called, again, I wasn't working that day, but I think I did call in some quotes for another story. Yeah, I talked to some people, but it was just such a sea of people, and the Commercial Appeal had like 3 or 4 other reporters out there. I mean, we covered that story. I mean, we were all over it. So I didn't have to do much. It was hot, obviously, because it was the middle of August. I just remember people passing out and being carried away and put in ambulances, and people just, because it was such a crowded scene, and it was so hot, and they didn't have bottled water. So I just remember just the frantic nature of the whole scene.
Wow. So how long did this go on after he died? I mean, I know that we cover certain stories, but the news cycle continues, and then some things fall through the cracks, but this is Elvis, obviously. So how long did this kind of go on?
Well, I mean, it went on daily until his funeral. People were still here. People were still crowded around Graceland. After his funeral, he originally was buried in Forest Hill Cemetery, which is sort of up the street from Graceland. And that was an unbelievable scene. It was also interesting to see all the celebrities who came for the funeral. I remember, I think it was Caroline Kennedy was here, and there were others, and I think somebody even got a photograph of Elvis in the casket, which was kind of morbid. We didn't publish it, but I think one of the tabloids did. But it was just an incredible scene. Anne Margaret was here, of course, and just
Priscilla and the other ex-wives, do they all show up?
I don't remember everybody, but yeah, I'm sure
there was a rumor that him and Priscilla were actually working on getting back together.
Well,
right
yeah,
for the end,
right.
So.
I've heard that since then. But yeah, I mean, obviously she and Lisa Marie, the little daughter, she was little at that time. Yeah, it was just quite a scene with people and celebrities and just ordinary people. Some people flew from out of the country just to be here and take in. I mean, it was frantic.
Which back then seems almost unheard of. Like today, people pop on jets and are in different places, multiple places a day. So that seems fascinating of itself. But then you mentioned the fact that he was first buried, and I think that's an important note that some people don't necessarily realize. He's not always been at Graceland, but there's a very important reason why he was moved. Can you tell us about that?
Well, I mean, what I know about it is that I think they wanted to keep.
People were trying to get into his grave.
That's what I mean, right? I'm trying to say this tactfully.
No, just
they
say
were trying to keep people from stealing the body, or trying to do something, desecrate, whatever it was, and they felt like they could have a lot more security over his body there. And so that's what they did. So they moved the body. He's there now, I think, even with his parents are there at Graceland. And so at that time, his father was still alive, but his mother had passed, I think, in the 1958 or somewhere around that. So that was the reason that they did that.
They had to get a law passed just to move him, didn't they? Or some sort of regulation, because to move him onto
it's probably
property
to move
like
on private property. I'm sure they did, but I don't think that was a problem. I mean, people knew, and some of them even envisioned this will turn Memphis into a tourist attraction. A lot of people were thinking that even then.
That's terrible.
And
but I get it.
But yeah, I mean, I don't think that they were being mean or morbid about that. They just saw that Elvis is going to be good for business going forward.
I will say I am thankful that y'all did not use the headline that Elvis had officially left the building, because I feel like that is like the low-hanging fruit.
Oh yeah.
And I'm really glad y'all didn't do that.
Well, we were a lot more conservative in terms of our headlines even back then. I think I remember the headline says, I think it said, "Death captures crown of rock and roll." I think that's what the big headline said. On my story, I think it was a quote from one of the people that we interviewed that said, "Are you sure there's no mistake?" And then the second line said, "The desired answer never came." which was I thought it was a great headline.
That is,
and
very powerful.
I don't remember who wrote it, but it was a wonderful headline. And again, as you say, it was right there on the fold, so you couldn't miss it. When you're buying the newspaper, it's folded, and there my name is right there with that great headline. And of course, you got the picture of Elvis, you got the ambulance that brought him in. All of that is on the front page. Again, it's a classic front page now.
It is. And okay, so he's been dead now longer than he's been alive. So what keeps it going?
I just think that there's a mystique around it, Chelsea. I just think that the legend continues to grow, and it's fueled mostly by people around the country, but also around the world, who for some unexplained reason just have this fascination with the aura and the legacy of Elvis. And when you go back now and you look at some of his performances, some of his songs, the guy could sing.
Yes.
Now let's be honest about it. He could sing.
He's a good-looking guy too.
And he's a good-looking guy. And he was a great performer. And so I think people started looking at him in a different light. Plus, you have young people who were not even around when Elvis died. And they are discovering this guy. And I'm sure their parents and their relatives and their older friends are telling them about him, so they are now involved in it. He's one of those once-in-a-lifetime people, a character, a performer, an entertainer, who just captures the imagination. And he certainly did. I got a newfound respect. I never met Elvis. I came close a couple of times. I did a couple of stories about him that year. There was some guy who came here from, I think he was from Germany, and he was found out at Graceland, and he was trying to get in to see Elvis, and they sent me out there to do a story about him, and because I think the police were giving him a lot of trouble, and so I did a story about that. When I was in Jackson, I had done a story about people. Elvis was doing a concert down there, and somebody had a couple of tickets, and they put an ad in the newspaper to sell the tickets, and they started bidding on the tickets. And I did a story about that. But I never got to meet Elvis. After his death and in the years that followed, I did a lot of stories, especially about issues around Elvis that came to court, because I was covering the courts at that time. And I just got a new appreciation for the guy. I mean, he was down to earth. He was just a humble guy. He used to come by the newsroom with the newspaper a lot. He had a lot of friends at the newspaper, and there's this iconic picture of him in the newsroom reading a story about him. I think it was a story out of Canada or somewhere, and he's got his foot up on the wall and right next to this old Associated Press teletype. It's just a classic story. And then we got a lot of photographs of him on his motorcycle. I mean, it's just, Elvis was just a guy that once he died, people realized just how much he was part of Memphis and how we really liked Elvis.
Yeah.
And I got a newfound appreciation for him.
I think it's hard too now seeing like George Klein. We've lost George Klein because my mom was a part of Talent Party.
Right.
Elvis kissed my mom twice. Just saying. All right.
Lucky mom.
So anyway, so you said you wrote obituaries. Did you write Elvis's obit?
I did not write his official obit, no. I mean, that story, and I wrote some other stories later on, but around his death, that one story was the main story that I wrote. Larry Buser, who was a reporter, a really good reporter at the Commercial Appeal, he wrote the main story that night. I remember William Thomas wrote, who was a great writer, he wrote what probably would be considered the obituary, trying to explaining, putting Elvis in the context. And I remember that lead paragraph that on that story was just classic. But no, I did not write his obituary. I kind of wish I had.
What a task to try to put him into just a a column.
Yeah.
But do you think, because we see, they have the 27 Club, with Jim Morrison, you've got Amy Winehouse, the list can go on,
right.
and other people who've lost early, like Marilyn Monroe.
Right.
And he kind of falls into that classic group of people who lost too soon.
Yeah,
do you
that's
think,
true. He does.
had he lived out a normal life and died of old
Natural
age,
causes.
maybe around now, because he'd be, I guess, in his 80s or
Oh, he
close
would
enough.
be in his 80s.
Yeah, so would he have the same power?
It's hard to say. I would doubt it.
Yeah.
I think that, again, we were talking earlier about the genres of music, and you know how things have changed since the 1970s. We went through the disco era, and then we got into rap and hip hop, and pop music. Country is still strong. If he had wanted to do country, he could have done that. But I don't think so. I think that he would have just sort of been in retirement, just sort of living his life, and
People wouldn't be paying and being all over his house.
and they would not. and again, I'm not being morbid when I say this, but the Elvis Presley Enterprises has been very profitable since 1977. That's unfortunate, but unfortunate that his ticket's death for that to happen. But it did happen, and Elvis Presley Enterprises is a mega business right now.
And for us as a city, an icon, obviously.
No question.
All right, 3 words, when you think of that day, tell me what 3 words you would use to describe it.
Wow. Shocking, exciting, and historic.
It's pretty solid choices.
Yeah.
Or is there anything we haven't talked about that you feel like we should talk about when it comes to the King?
Well, it's really interesting, and I teach at the University of Memphis now and have for the last 10 years. And every semester, I didn't do it this year because we were on Zoom, but every semester in one of my classes, I draw a distinction between how the national news networks covered Elvis as opposed to how they covered Michael Jackson and Prince. And the differences are unbelievable, Chelsea. In 1977, you didn't have cable news like CNN and MSNBC and none of that. So when the 5 o'clock or 5:30 evening news came on, you had Walter Cronkite in a very straightforward way saying Elvis Presley died. On NBC, you had Huntley Brinkley, and David Brinkley came on in just the most deadpan way, saying Elvis Presley died, and they did it was boring compared to how they would cover it. Imagine how it would be covered today.
Oh, yeah, today would be very...
It's unbelievable.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was just so...
Think about the weight, though, on... Let's just talk about Cronkite. I mean, he had to talk about JFK. He had to talk about all these, just delivering these horrible... But that's why he's so great.
That's why he's so good.
That's a story for another
But he
day.
did a great job. He did a great job. But I just thought that again, it was a different era. You didn't have social media. The news spread around thanks to television, radio, the newspapers, telephones, because people were calling everybody. But the news reached everybody. And it was, again, it is the most significant story of my 45-year career in journalism.
Well, I appreciate you talking to me about it, and I'm just excited I found that newspaper.
Well, I'm glad you did too.
I just happen to be one of those people that's a young Elvis fan, and I love Graceland, and I love going, and anyway, I'm pro Elvis, so thank you so much.
Well, we should all be pro Elvis.
We should.
I mean, this city, Elvis means a lot to this city.
To break the stigma that it's not cool to be a Memphian and go to Graceland. I don't understand it.
I
I
don't
never
either.
will. It's really cool. I've been like 7 times. It's the first place I take people. Anyways, well, thank you so much.